Next type of execution questions are troubleshooting, also known as debugging or root cause analysis. To answer them, we will follow a 4-step solution approach. Start with breaking down the affected metric and collecting data to localize the problem. Next, deep dive into the problem by analyzing user funnel. Then brainstorm potential root causes based on what you learned from data. And finally, propose solutions or mitigations. Of course, this is not the only way to solve these problems, but this is how I would investigate metrics issues in real life, and that's the approach I recommend. So let's use the solution steps in our standard response framework to answer the following example problem. You are a PM on Facebook events. You notice an overnight drop of 10% in RSVP volume. How do you determine what happened? As always, we start with clarifying questions. Here you need to understand the product, the metric, and case objectives. If the question comes as a follow-up to a goal-setting problem, which is what often happens, then you probably already understand the product and the metric, and you just need to validate your case objectives and state relevant assumptions. So in our example, first I would confirm how the product works. Users can create events, invite people, find events, and RSVP. Number of RSVPs is down by 10% overnight, which includes all types of responses. I believe events used to have RSVP options such as yes, no, and maybe, but now it's only going and interested. So we'll assume that both of those types of responses are included in this decline. And the objective is to find out what happened and come up with a solution. Next step is to briefly outline your approach. This allows you to organize your thoughts, demonstrate structured thinking, and also gives the interviewer an opportunity to guide you in a certain direction if necessary. So in our example, I recognize the problem type as troubleshooting, and I will explain my approach as follows. First, I will break down the metric and collect data to see what's going on, try to narrow down the problem. Next, I will look into the user funnel to understand at what step of the user journey the problem happens. Then I'll brainstorm possible root causes of the decline in RSVP volume. And if we have time, I'll think about ways we could solve the problem or mitigate it. How does it sound? Okay, now we are in the solution phase, and step 1 is to break down the metric. This includes 2 parts. First, you need to deconstruct the affected metric, basically define it as a formula. It's particularly important to do for top-line metrics like revenue or total time spent, because that allows you to identify what's driving the change and helps you narrow down the problem. So, for example, revenue is driven by number of units sold or number of transactions multiplied by amount per unit. So, for revenue to be down, you must be selling fewer units or you are selling them for less. Time spent equals number of user sessions multiplied by duration or session length. Number of user actions depends on number of users and average number of actions per user. So if your product engagement is down, it could be because there are fewer users or your users are less engaged. And even more fundamental metrics like number of active users can be broken up into number of new users plus existing users, those who were retained during the time period, and resurrected users, those who previously churned and came back. So this way you can decide if the problem seems to be with user acquisition or retention or something else. Once you deconstruct the metric and identify what's driving change, you can try to further localize the problem by breaking it down along a few dimensions. First one is time. See if the change is sudden, like an overnight drop in our example, or gradual, that's happening over a longer period of time. Understand if this is part of normal metric movement due to regular usage patterns, like weekdays versus weekends, and if there are any seasonality factors, like holidays or time of the year. Next breakdown is region, like geographic regions or markets, to see if the problem is affecting particular regions versus everything. Platform, which includes desktop versus mobile or versus web. Device type, for example, tablet versus phone. and operating systems or software versions. And the last breakdown type I suggest doing is by user group, which includes comparing the behavior of new users versus existing users, paid versus free, if applicable, power users versus casual users, and so on. I highly recommend listing all these breakdowns up front, and then asking if we learned anything from that, rather than going through one at a time. This way you can demonstrate your ability to conduct a much more comprehensive investigation, rather than simply using a trial and error approach. So let's break down the metric in our example. RSVP volume, or the total number of RSVPs, can be broken up into number of events and the average number of RSVPs per event. So in order for the total RSVP volume to be down, the following must be true. Either the number of events created is down, which indicates the problem with event creation or supply side, or the average number of RSVPs per event is down, which indicates the problem with demand side. Or both 1 and 2 could be true. For the purpose of this exercise, let's say the data shows that the number of events is not affected, and the problem seems to be driven by fewer responses per event. So that means we need to analyze the user funnel on the event consumption side to understand what's going on there. But before doing so, I'd like to collect some more data. First of all, I would check the number of active users overall. It could be a platform-wide decline rather than a problem with events. But assuming that's normal, I would start looking closer at the change in RSVP volume. If possible, I would get the following breakdowns. Time. We know this is an overnight drop, but I'd like to understand if these kind of fluctuations are normal or very unusual. So I would like to look at how this metric was trending over the past few weeks or months, and also compare this metric to a similar period last year to account for seasonality. Next, I would look at geographic breakdowns to see if this drop is uniform across all regions and markets or localized somewhere. I would also break down the RSVP volume by users on different platforms. So for example, mobile versus web. Within mobile, we can break it down by Android versus iOS devices, and so on. And I would also try to see if the problem is affecting particular user groups more than others by looking at a variety of user segments. For example, by number of friends, by time spent, or by demographics, and so on. At this point, I would pause and ask if any of the listed breakdowns help localize the problem. If not, then we know the problem is widespread. But let's assume we are told the issue appears to be present in North America and is affecting users on iOS mobile devices only. Step 2 is to analyze the user funnel. If you did the metric breakdowns like we showed earlier, you would know by now if the problem is on demand side or supply side for marketplace type products. So you don't need to analyze the user funnel for each user type. Now, it's just a matter of listing key user actions along user journey upstream from the affected metric. This is very similar to how we do it in the goal setting problems, except we are focused on just one metric and all the events it depends on. So for the events goer side user journey, I would list the following key actions. Log into Facebook app, find events by searching or seeing Facebook recommendations or by looking at friends activity, navigate to the events detail page, and finally RSVP or just leave without taking any action. So we know the problem manifests at this last step because we are getting fewer responses, but we don't know if this is where the root cause is. We also know that the number of active users is not affected, so the initial step of logging into Facebook app is okay. We just need to check the discovery step and the events detail page experience. On the discovery step, I would investigate each method by which users can find an event. Search, recommendations, newsfeed activity. So I would check the following metrics: number of searches conducted, number of events recommendations shown in newsfeed, and number of events shown based on friends activity. And I would look at click-through rate for each of those, which shows the quality and relevance of search results and recommendations. If people are not clicking on search results or recommendations in newsfeed, as much as they used to. Maybe we are not showing the best results. And on the event detail page, I would check the following metrics: time spent on the events page, engagement, including things like posts, comments, reactions, and shares, and bounce rate, which shows percent of the visits that end without any response. This should give us a pretty complete picture of the user funnel and point us in the right direction for identifying the root cause. So now it's time to actually come up with ideas on what could be causing the issue. A good way to do it is by breaking it down into internal and external factors. Internal factors include product changes that could have introduced new bugs or just made the product worse. Maybe there is a little bit of learning curve to get used to the new user experience, which can lead to a temporary decline in engagement, or cannibalization if there are changes to other parts of the product ecosystem with unintended consequences. Platform issues, things like performance, reliability, service availability. These issues can make the product less usable and lead to a drop in engagement or a change in user behavior. And it's always a good idea to consider issues with the data itself, due to logging, data pipelines, how the metric is calculated and reported. External factors are things like market conditions, competition, dependencies on external partners, systemic changes in user behavior, for example, a shift to mobile. And of course, there are factors like seasonality and one-off events, like natural disasters, political turmoil, regulations, sporting events, etc. Not all of these will be applicable depending on what you learned from your investigation up to this point, so you have to use judgment to come up with plausible root causes. Let's say we found that CTR from search is down, which leads to fewer visits to the events page and therefore fewer responses. So why would CTR drop in North America and on iOS devices only? I can think of a few possibilities. Normally, changes in the search ranking and retrieval would be my first guess for a problem like this. But given the impact is limited to a certain region and device type, I think it's unlikely to be caused by server-side changes. But it's still a good idea to check just in case. A more likely root cause, in my opinion, are UX changes, which are often deployed on specific platforms and rolled out gradually in different regions. So I would check if we made any changes to the iOS app in North America, particularly in the search results page over the last few days. It's also possible that we have some platform and infra issues impacting iOS devices in particular, so I would check our service availability and performance dashboards to see if something is wrong there. And if the above steps don't reveal any problem, we may need to look deeper. So I would ask our engineers to analyze system and product logs and see if we can run some diagnostics to find potential bugs. Finally, I would verify if the data itself is incorrect, which could be caused by issues with our events logging, data pipelines, or reporting. So by using the process of elimination, we can probably rule out most of these issues and zero in on the actual root cause. Let's say we did that and it turns out that there was a change to the search UX that was shipped to the iOS devices and rolled out in North America. And we believe that's exactly what's causing the decline in RSVP volume. The last step is to propose some mitigation. You are not expected to go deep into solutions here, but you should provide a high-level action plan to address the issue. Of course, it has to be specific to the problem, but there are some general steps that apply in many scenarios. A few common ideas for internal issues include fixing the bugs, rolling back the changes, or evaluating trade-offs and deciding if it's worth it, for example, if there is a cannibalization issue. Externally, we may need to come up with a response to competition, pivot to adapt to the changing market conditions and user behavior, or handle any pressing marketing and PR issues. In our scenario, I would first investigate how we made the launch decision. Was there an experiment conducted? Did we have a specific goal we were trying to achieve with this launch? Was it approved by relevant stakeholders? Did we consider possible side effects? Based on that, we may need to roll back the changes to prevent further damage, or make a quick improvement if possible, or simply accept the trade-off if it's reasonable. Finally, I would conduct a post-mortem to understand why we were unaware of this change and its effect, and ensure that future launches are better planned and executed. To wrap up your response, give a quick summary of what you discussed. You will not always have time for this, but if you do, it's a nice way to tie it all up. It's also a nice way to make any corrections or mention things that you initially missed, which shows good awareness and allows you to add another dimension to your answer. So let me take a moment to summarize my answer. Facebook events saw a decline of 10% in RSVP volume overnight. We established that the problem was a result of UX change on the iOS app in North America. We proposed an action plan to understand how we made the launch decision, roll back the change if necessary, and conduct a post-mortem to implement preventive measures. Lastly, here are a few common mistakes that I often see people make. First is not fully understanding the metric. For example, engagement is down can mean a lot of things. It's important to clarify the definition and meaning of the metric. Turning the interview into a Q&A session, where the candidate asks one question at a time, for example, is this metric down everywhere or in a specific market? Waiting for an answer, then asking the next question. Remember, there isn't necessarily a specific root cause that you're expected to find. The goal is to understand how you would diagnose any sort of problem, so it's much better to provide a holistic set of questions. Think of it as if you were writing an email to your data analysts requesting a bunch of data cuts. Another very common mistake is jumping straight into root cause analysis without analyzing the user funnel and not understanding where the problem occurs in the user journey. This means you have to come up with a much wider range of possible root causes because you did not eliminate any of them. Next problem I see often is when people start listing prepared root causes that are not specific to the problem at hand. I call these low relevance hypotheses. You need to be able to adjust your framework based on the information you receive. And not proposing any solutions or mitigations to the problem you identified. Another common mistake. Strong candidates proactively come up with an action plan to navigate the situation.